Laura Mason had never been someone to invite conflict. A consultant by trade, pragmatic by personality, and innately methodical in her routines, she had deliberately moved out of the bustle of the inner city and into a quiet suburban stretch on the edge of a historic district. The property she purchased wasn't anything extravagant. It was modest but meaningful, with just under half an acre of land that wrapped around her single-story brick home like a quiet barrier between her and the world. What had drawn her to this particular property, aside from the natural overgrowth and the shade-rich soil that suited her side hobby of native plant restoration, was the old fence. It wasn't pretty by most standards. Made from thick, weather-worn oak and lined with climbing vines that had grown into its grooves like veins, the fence had stood longer than the neighbors on either side had lived there. But for Laura, it represented a line, a boundary not just of land, but of peace. Something about that physical perimeter gave her a sense of order. It defined the space she called hers. She never thought that would be challenged. The first months in her new home were peaceful. She kept to herself mostly, working long hours from her home office, and occasionally tending to the backyard in the early mornings before the sun could turn the soil to clay. She'd begun planting slow-growing ferns along the back fence and transplanting a row of white-flowered dogwoods along the front drive. The neighborhood itself was quiet, the kind where people rarely stopped to talk, but nodded politely when taking out the trash or collecting their mail. It suited Laura, but even early on, there were signs that one neighbor in particular didn't share her definition of boundaries. Karen lived directly across the street, in a large corner lot house that had undergone aggressive landscaping. A bright green lawn that looked artificial even when it wasn't. Ornamental trees cut into shapes, and mulch beds that screamed symmetry more than nature. From the first week, Karen had made comments. Not in a directly confrontational way, but as part of those strange, half-friendly, half-passive-aggressive conversations that suburban veterans had perfected. "That fence of yours really keeps things enclosed," she'd said once with an exaggerated smile. Another time, while Laura was unloading lumber from her car for a small storage shed, Karen walked over uninvited to say, "You know, the old owner always said he wanted to tear that thing down and open up the view. Too bad he never got around to it." Laura had learned to brush those moments off, not because she didn't recognize them for what they were, little territorial jabs, probes to test her response, but because engaging with that kind of personality was like pouring gasoline on a brush fire. She wasn't interested in becoming the subject of gossip threads or block-wide complaints. Karen, from what little Laura had gathered through observation and a few overheard phone calls across the street, was a woman who needed to feel in control of her environment. She organized weekend cleanups for a neighborhood garden that nobody seemed to use, circulated monthly newsletters filled with reminders that always somehow referenced her own grievances, and frequently referred to aesthetics and community, image as though she personally owned the trademark. Still, Laura figured, as long as she stayed on her own property, planted her own plants, repaired her own fence panels, and lived quietly, there'd be no issue. But there was always tension beneath the surface. Karen had a way of standing too close to the edge of Laura's driveway when she was talking, as if to suggest the space wasn't clearly marked. When Laura had a few friends over one Saturday, quiet people, all in their 40s and 50s, sipping drinks on the porch in the evening, Karen had appeared the next morning at Laura's front step to mention, in that clipped tone of forced politeness, that some of us really value quiet after sunset. Laura apologized then, not because she believed she'd done anything wrong, but because it seemed easier. But the real unease began when she noticed Karen starting to walk her little white dog, always on a long, retractable leash, along the inside of the fence line, sometimes stopping to let it sniff at the posts, sometimes lingering longer than necessary. One afternoon, as Laura returned from the grocery store, she caught Karen standing directly in front of the fence, hand on her hip, squinting at the ground. Laura rolled down the window and asked if everything was all right. Karen responded without turning around, "Just wondering if these old fences don't actually eat up more space than they're worth." By the time mid-September arrived, Laura had finally taken the time to reinforce several sections of the fence that had weathered badly through spring storms. She didn't hire a contractor. She liked doing the work herself. She pressure washed the boards, replaced a few planks with new ones stained to match the original oak, and added small ground stakes for stability. It wasn't a full replacement, but it was thorough and precise, and it gave the entire structure a quiet strength that pleased her more than she expected. The morning after she finished the work, she spotted Karen watching from her porch. She didn't wave. She simply stood, arms crossed as Laura collected her tools. That silent observation felt more invasive than any words would have been. And then it happened. It was a Thursday like any other. Laura had an early client meeting across town and left home by 7:15 a.m., locking the gate behind her and leaving the house dark to keep it cool. Nothing seemed unusual. No noises, no trucks, no warning signs. But when she returned just after 6 p.m., her driveway was filled with dust, tire imprints curled into the gravel, and her entire front fence, every panel, every post, every anchored rail, was gone. Not broken, not vandalized. Gone. The grass was scraped up in places where machinery had clearly backed in. Deep gouges marked the soil, and in the distance, near the end of the street, she caught the tail end of a flatbed truck pulling away. For a full minute, Laura sat in her car, one hand still on the gear shift, staring at the vacant line where the fence had once stood. At first, her mind searched for logical explanations. Was this the wrong address? Had she been robbed? Had something collapsed? But the evenness of the destruction, deliberate, precise, complete, told a different story. This wasn't chaos. This was an operation. Laura stepped out, slowly walking the edge of the property where the fence had stood just that morning. The soil was torn and bare, and where the fence once defined her world, there was now nothing but open air between her front windows and the road. As she approached the spot where the corner post had been anchored, an old oak base sunk into concrete, she noticed a small stake in the ground with a laminated tag tied to it. It read, "Plot line, adjustment pending." And under it, in smaller type, "Removal authorized for safety and visual obstruction." No name, no phone number. But on the back, in faint ballpoint pen, were 2 letters. KS. The initials didn't need translation, and across the street in her familiar stance, Karen stood at the edge of her porch, arms crossed again, sipping from a glass of something with ice in it. She tilted her head slightly as their eyes met, gave a single raised eyebrow, and turned back inside without a word. Laura didn't move. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, breathing through her nose, feeling her jaw tighten. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had made a calculated decision to eliminate something that wasn't theirs to touch. And tomorrow, Laura would begin the work of making sure that whoever did it would be held responsible. Not with revenge, not with emotion, but with something far sharper. The law. The next morning arrived not with the familiar softness of sunlight filtering through Laura's front windows, but with a harsh mechanical groan just outside her driveway. She awoke with the residual tension from the day before still clinging to her shoulders, a tension that turned into something more visceral when she looked out and saw a small utility truck, parked half on, half off her lawn. 2 men in reflective vests were pacing back and forth near the boundary of her property, holding clipboards and gesturing toward the exposed earth where her fence had once stood. Laura pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt and walked out calmly, but with the kind of internal stiffness that made every step feel too controlled. One of the men glanced at her with a casual nod, assuming she was part of whatever arrangement had been made. When she asked what they were doing on her property, the taller one answered matter-of-factly, "We're here to mark the revised boundary line for landscaping prep. That's what the work order says." Laura didn't raise her voice. She simply asked to see the order. The man hesitated slightly, then flipped through a stack of forms and handed her a photocopy. It was an informal document, not on city letterhead or anything official, but it referenced her address and stated that the area was slated for clearance and beautification under voluntary neighborhood compliance, with initials and a typed signature, K. Sampson. The authorization section bore a squiggled name that was supposed to be hers, Laura Mason. But the signature was not hers, not even close. Laura felt a slow, cold rage begin to burn through the fog of disbelief. She told the workers firmly that there was no authorization from her, that the property in question was hers alone, and that any further work would be treated as trespassing. The men didn't argue. They had no loyalty to whoever had signed the form. They were third-party subcontractors paid to do a job, not to defend it. They left within 10 minutes, but not before Laura took photos of the truck, the form, the disturbed soil, and the laminated marker she'd found the day before. She went back inside and made coffee, not because she wanted it, but because she needed the ritual. Something tangible to center herself as she opened her laptop and began looking through her property documents. The deed was in her name alone, and the original site survey clearly outlined the fence's placement as being well within the boundary lines. She pulled up a folder with scans of all her closing documents, including the disclosure from the previous owner stating that the fence had been installed in the 1980s and had never been contested by neighbors. By mid-morning, she had already contacted the city's zoning department, explained the situation to a surprisingly sympathetic clerk, and requested an inspection to verify property boundaries. The clerk offered to expedite a visit from a municipal land assessor within the next 2 days, due to the property damage already incurred. Laura thanked him, her tone professional but tight, and made a note to follow up with the police department as well. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't just a zoning issue or a misunderstanding. This was targeted, premeditated, coordinated. Someone, Karen, had taken it upon themselves to remove part of her property, impersonate her signature, and initiate changes with outside contractors. And that crossed every line that mattered. At noon, a white envelope was slid under her front door. There was no knock, no ring of the bell, just the faint shuffle of paper on wood. Laura picked it up cautiously. Inside was a typed letter. No header, no name, stating that a neighbor-driven beautification effort was underway to preserve community standards and improve visual cohesion. It claimed that the fence in question had been visually obstructive and structurally compromised, citing anonymous concerns about visibility for pedestrians and drivers. The final line read, "Please refrain from rebuilding until a formal review has been completed." It wasn't signed, but Laura didn't need a name. The phrasing reeked of Karen's synthetic civility, that veneer of polite dictatorship that wrapped its claws in the language of order and community wellness. That same tone had bled through Karen's newsletter updates, her impromptu lawn-side monologues, and her thinly veiled complaints about other people's lack of vision. But now it was in writing, and it was actionable. Laura documented the letter, placed it in a plastic folder, and drove to the local police precinct. She didn't expect a SWAT team to descend on Karen's property, but she wanted to establish a record. A report, something formal. She explained the situation to the desk officer, a younger woman who listened carefully, took notes, and filed an official complaint for property destruction and suspected fraud. Laura provided copies of her deed, the fake authorization form from the workers, the photographs, and the unsigned letter. The officer said someone would follow up within the week. Laura understood bureaucracy. She didn't expect immediate results, but she needed the paper trail. When she returned home that afternoon, a different kind of trail awaited her. A narrow strip of synthetic grass, identical to the one used in Karen's front lawn, had been rolled out just along the edge of Laura's driveway, right where the fence had been. A dozen ornamental solar lights had been stabbed into the dirt, evenly spaced like placeholders for some future design. There was no note this time, no letter, just the silent assertion of intent, a passive invasion of aesthetics into what had been private space. Laura didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she opened her back gate, walked to the garage, and retrieved a measuring wheel. She took her time, walking slowly, carefully, documenting each segment of her property line according to the survey. She cross-checked it with her original plot plan, noted the discrepancies, and saved the data to her cloud account. She spent the next few hours writing an email to a property rights attorney she'd found through a local referral service. She didn't dramatize the situation. She outlined it clearly, attaching files, timestamps, and a brief statement of the facts. It was her style, precise, detached, organized. But inside she was furious, not just at the audacity of the violation, but at how brazenly it was being disguised as something benign. How quickly this neighborhood's surface-level politeness had become a tool for coercion. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long orange streaks across the front yard, Laura sat on the steps of her porch, notebook in hand, sketching the outline of the fence she planned to rebuild. This time it wouldn't just be wood and nails. It would be declaration. A physical assertion that her boundaries were not suggestions. She wasn't impulsive. She wouldn't retaliate in anger, but she would respond with precision. She would build stronger, smarter. She would follow the law to the letter, and if someone crossed the line again, there would be more than just consequences. There would be accountability, and it would be public, procedural, and permanent. The following days passed not with the natural rhythm of suburban normalcy, but under the steady hum of tension that settled over Laura's home, like fog that refused to lift. There was no quiet anymore, no sanctuary in her morning coffee or routine walks around the garden. Each time she stepped outside, her eyes were drawn not to the plants she'd spent months cultivating, or the soft arc of her gravel path, but to the gaping, violated stretch of earth where her fence had stood. She had begun to feel as though she was being watched, not in the cinematic sense of shadows behind curtains or cameras hidden in trees, but in the banal, everyday way that certain people assert their presence. An extra long glance from a neighbor at the mailbox, the sudden silence of a dog that had been barking until she stepped onto her porch. The unmistakable sense that her absence was noted just as keenly as her return. Karen didn't say anything in those early days after the incident. She didn't need to. Her silence was a kind of posture, and her actions, though minimal, were deliberate. 2 days after Laura had filed her police report, a new marker appeared at the edge of the property. This time, a fiberglass sign that read, "Proposed Community Greenway. Consultation in progress." It was planted exactly where the fence post had once stood and bore the same laminated texture and phrasing style as the letter Laura had received. Beneath the print was a sticker with a QR code leading to a page on the city's Parks and Rec website, but the link itself returned a 404 error. It wasn't official. It was a bluff, and one that looked to the untrained eye entirely legitimate. Laura knew better than to confront Karen directly. That wasn't how this kind of game was played. Directness invited escalation, and escalation without leverage was a fool's strategy. Instead, she focused on consolidating evidence. She met with the municipal land assessor who had been assigned to her case, a no-nonsense woman named Sheila who arrived in a city-issued SUV, clipboard in hand, and an air of weary familiarity with this kind of dispute. Sheila walked the property with Laura, confirming the boundary markers based on the official site survey, and took her own photographs, documenting the remnants of the old post holes and the placement of the synthetic grass strip. "It's a classic push," Sheila said, tapping one boot against the makeshift lawn divider. "Create visual ambiguity, let time soften the memory, and boom. People forget where the line was. Especially if you make it look clean." Laura asked if anything could be done formally to remove the encroachment, and Sheila advised that a zoning violation could be issued if the installation crossed the property line, but that enforcement would likely be slow unless pressure was applied through legal channels. It wasn't hopeless, but it wouldn't be fast either. Laura thanked her, took the violation referral sheet Sheila provided, and added it to her growing file of documents, all neatly organized and duplicated in digital format. What disturbed her most wasn't Karen's gall, but the way the neighborhood began to shift around the edges. People who once nodded at her now averted their gaze. One afternoon, as Laura walked to the corner to drop off a package, she overheard two women in yoga attire discussing the drama on Ashwood in hushed tones. She didn't need confirmation to know it was about her. A week after the fence had been torn down, a typed flyer was slipped into every mailbox on the block. It was unsigned, formatted like a community bulletin, and described an effort to revitalize shared spaces, calling for residents to support the removal of unsafe or unsightly installations. It made no mention of her directly, but the implication was unmistakable. Karen was shaping the narrative, subtly but effectively. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about perception. Laura's attorney responded 3 days later. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and his email was short, formal, and full of promise. He confirmed receipt of her documentation, acknowledged that her case appeared to involve both civil property violations and potential criminal misrepresentation, and suggested a preliminary consultation the following Monday. When they met in his office, spare, efficient, lined with casebooks, he didn't waste time. He asked precise questions, walked through the timeline with her, and nodded as she detailed the chain of events. His focus sharpened when she showed him the forged authorization form and the QR-coded sign. "This isn't just some neighbor dispute," he said at one point. "This is a targeted effort to reframe legal property as communal domain. It's clever, actually. Brazen, but clever." Laura felt something shift inside her. Not relief exactly, but the first flicker of shared recognition. The validation of her instincts by someone with power to act. Ethan advised her to proceed on two fronts. First, filing a cease and desist order against Karen for unauthorized development, and second, requesting a formal inquiry through the city's attorney liaison into the use of fraudulent documentation and municipal channels. The next few days were consumed with paperwork. Laura signed affidavits, compiled timelines, annotated photos with metadata timestamps, and drafted a letter to the city inspector's office with Ethan's guidance. In the meantime, Karen escalated. She installed a new row of hedges along the disputed stretch of land. Not deep-rooted, not even well-planted, but visually present. It was a claim, an occupation disguised as landscaping. One morning, Laura woke to find a crew of day laborers installing 3 decorative stones just beyond her original fence line. They wore no uniforms, spoke little English, and worked quickly, moving like they had been told not to interact. Laura didn't interfere. She documented every angle, every action, and she called Ethan. By the end of that day, he had filed for an emergency hearing to request a temporary restraining order on further changes to the property until the matter could be formally adjudicated. The hearing was set for the following Friday. Word of the filing spread quickly. Laura didn't know how, but she suspected Karen had a network of sympathetic ears. That week, she found herself increasingly isolated. A neighbor she'd once shared gardening tips with crossed the street to avoid her. Her compost bin was overturned twice in 3 days. Her motion-activated lights began going off at odd hours, and on one particularly cold morning, she found a pile of clipped brush dumped on her front steps. Nothing overtly threatening, just a steady drip of nuisance and intimidation, enough to fray nerves but not quite enough to call the police. Laura did what she knew how to do. She recorded everything. She cataloged every incident, kept a daily log, and focused on preparation. The night before the hearing, she reviewed her case file 3 times, rehearsing responses in her head, steadying her voice with deep, deliberate breathing. It wasn't about emotion. It was about establishing fact. Karen, for all her theatrics, hadn't expected resistance of this kind, and Laura planned to meet her not with anger but with law. Friday arrived overcast and cold, and Laura stood in front of the county courthouse with Ethan, her file clutched under one arm. When Karen arrived, late, overdressed, wearing a blazer far too formal for a preliminary hearing, she smiled in a way that suggested she still thought this was just some neighborhood spat. Laura didn't smile back. Inside the courtroom, the judge listened patiently as Ethan outlined the series of events, presenting evidence with the calm precision of a surgeon. Maps, deeds, surveyor notes, photographic records, sworn statements, timestamps. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she leaned heavily on charm and vagueness, insisting that everyone thought the fence was temporary and there had been discussions with the previous owner. She produced a printed email chain with no headers, no dates, no context. Barely admissible, but clearly meant to sow doubt. The judge reviewed the material with a neutral expression and then delivered a statement that made Laura feel her breath return in full for the first time in days. Until further adjudication, no additional development, landscaping, or structural installation may occur within the disputed boundary. All existing modifications must be paused. The court would schedule a full hearing in the coming weeks to determine legal ownership and possible damages. For now, the line was held. Karen's face tightened, the smile faltering only for a second. She said nothing as she left. Laura didn't follow her out. She stood still, letting the quiet weight of that small victory settle into her bones. This wasn't over, but it was the beginning of the end. The first wall rebuilt, not of wood, but of principle. And this one, Karen would not tear down. The weeks following the preliminary hearing were defined by a silence that was neither peace nor resolution, but something far more uneasy. An enforced ceasefire held together by legal restraint rather than genuine compromise. Karen had halted her landscaping efforts along the disputed line, but the physical reminders of her intrusion remained in place, as if deliberately left to provoke. The row of ornamental hedges now dry and browning from lack of care, the 3 decorative stones that had not been removed but merely covered with tarps weighted by bricks, and that same synthetic strip of turf now fraying at the edges, curling like old paper beneath the pressure of rain and time. Laura remained vigilant. She knew better than to mistake compliance with surrender. The upcoming hearing would determine the legal status of the property line, and until then, she continued to gather and refine her case under Ethan's guidance. But the dynamic had changed. What had once been a battle over territory was morphing into something stranger, more insidious, something that no longer felt rooted in land, but in power and perception. And Laura began to see that Karen's campaign wasn't just against her fence or her boundary, but against her presence in the neighborhood itself. It started with letters, not to Laura, but about her. Anonymous messages began appearing in mailboxes across the block, typed in the same style as the original community beautification flyer, but now clearly referencing her, though never by name. They used phrases like certain residents and recent arrivals who disregard established aesthetic values, and question the validity of recent legal actions taken against longtime homeowners. The implication was clear. Laura was being painted as an outsider, a disruptor, someone who threatened the carefully curated harmony that Karen claimed to represent. It was a subtle campaign, passive on the surface but designed to isolate. Laura felt the social frost intensify. Where before there had been quiet avoidance, now there was open coldness. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now crossed the street. Packages she ordered began arriving opened or damaged. Her garbage can was pushed over 3 times in 1 week, always in the same direction, always spilling into the gutter. When she filed a police report for vandalism, the officer was sympathetic but non-committal. "You're doing the right thing by going through the courts," he said. But neighborhood politics don't leave fingerprints. Amid all this, Ethan received a surprising piece of information. During a routine inquiry with the zoning board to support their claim, he discovered that the property adjacent to Laura's, an empty lot behind Karen's house, had recently been the subject of an application for a zoning variance, submitted under the YIKIM, name of a third-party trust. The application requested permission to develop a shared-use pedestrian easement that would connect Ashwood Drive to the commercial road beyond the block, using a corridor that would, if approved, cut directly through Laura's property line. The plan was marked as pending review, but had been quietly moving through the system without any notice sent to Laura, despite her being the directly affected landowner. Ethan immediately filed an objection and flagged the application with the city attorney's office. When they investigated further, they discovered that the trust managing the application was administered by a private holding company linked through a few degrees of separation to Karen's husband's former business partner. It wasn't direct. It wasn't illegal, but it was orchestrated. Laura wasn't just being harassed. Her property was being targeted for integration into a larger plan, one that would convert her legally defined boundary into a public access point under the guise of community development. This revelation was the pivot. Laura's anger sharpened into focus, no longer tethered to individual actions but to a strategy. Karen's behavior wasn't impulsive or merely personal. It was tactical, part of a broader effort to erode Laura's claim to autonomy, using the language of neighborhood improvement to mask a land grab. Ethan adjusted their approach. They prepared an amended filing to include obstruction of use and bad faith development practices, and they formally requested an injunction against the variance application. The city attorney's office, now alert to the underlying coordination, opened a preliminary investigation of its own. For the first time, the momentum shifted. Laura wasn't merely defending her fence anymore, she was exposing something far deeper. Still, the pressure did not ease. Karen, sensing the legal tide turning, doubled down in other ways. Late one night, Laura heard a noise in her front yard and turned on the porch light just in time to see someone sprinting away. In the morning, she found a freshly painted white line stretching across the dirt where her fence had once stood, a makeshift boundary drawn in defiance of both law and fact. On another evening, she received a voicemail from a blocked number warning her to stop making trouble and to learn how things work around here. The voice was male, unfamiliar, and left no trace. Laura handed the recording to Ethan and the police, who added it to their file but, again, offered no immediate action. These tactics were meant to wear her down, to make the process of resistance feel more exhausting than compliance. But Laura had already made her decision. There would be no surrender. The full hearing date was set for the following month. In the meantime, Ethan advised Laura to stay visible and consistent. No retaliatory behavior, no sudden changes. She maintained her routines, kept her property clean and well documented, and prepared for the next phase of the fight, but the emotional toll was real. There were moments when she questioned whether the land, the principle, the line in the soil were worth the constant pressure. But those moments never lasted. Because each time she saw that fraying strip of fake turf, or the way Karen walked her dog in wide arcs that brushed too close to the disputed zone, or the way neighbors muttered when she passed, she remembered that it wasn't just her space that had been violated, it was her right to define it. And now, with the truth about the variance application emerging and a paper trail forming that connected Karen's campaign to something more than neighborly animosity, Laura no longer felt isolated. She felt armed, not just with evidence, but with clarity. The next stage wouldn't be about defense, it would be about exposure. And when that moment came, the boundary she reestablished wouldn't be just physical. It would be legal, public, and irrevocable. The quiet before the next storm didn't last long, and Laura had begun to expect that any semblance of peace in the neighborhood was not only temporary, but more accurately a deceptive lull designed to disarm her before the next calculated move. The legal proceedings were still underway, the hearing date looming on the calendar like a steadily approaching train, and although Ethan reassured her that the early rulings and evidence had given them a significant advantage, Laura understood all too well that procedural victories meant little to someone like Karen, who was never truly playing by the same rules to begin with. It started again with sound. Distant at first, a rhythmic thud followed by the metallic clank of tools striking pavement. Then the unmistakable mechanical hum of power equipment. Laura was in her backyard tending to a soil test pit near her flower bed when she heard it. She stepped carefully around her irrigation markers, walked to the edge of her driveway, and froze. On the disputed side of her front property, just feet from where the original fence had stood, 2 men were unloading concrete panels from the back of a flatbed truck, while a third was adjusting a laser level on a tripod. A red string had been strung across a pair of temporary steel stakes hammered into the soil, forming a bold red slash through her lawn, positioned exactly along the line that the white paint had marked weeks earlier. The implication was clear. They were preparing to install a wall, and not just a symbolic one. Laura didn't shout. She didn't march across the grass and demand answers. Instead, she walked back inside, retrieved her phone, and called Ethan. She described what was happening as she watched it from her living room window, narrating every motion as if delivering a surveillance report. Ethan told her not to engage and said he would immediately notify the court to report a violation of the temporary restraining order. Within the hour, a deputy from the sheriff's department arrived on scene, speaking first to Laura, then to the foreman of the construction crew. After examining the order and cross-referencing the legal boundary documentation, the deputy instructed the workers to halt construction and vacate the property. The crew didn't argue. They weren't invested in the neighborhood drama. They were hired hands with no skin in the game. But the disruption had a cost. The edge of Laura's lawn was now marked with gouges from the equipment tires, her turf torn and left uneven, and a shallow trench had already been dug along the line for what would have been the foundation of the wall. The deputy apologized, saying they would document the damage and add it to the file, but Laura could see the frustration in his posture. These situations, he explained, were always the worst, where legality battled against perception, and escalation never seemed to deter the people responsible. That night, Karen made her first direct move in weeks. She left a note in Laura's mailbox, typed and unsigned, but the language was unmistakably hers. It accused Laura of abusing the legal system, of weaponizing bureaucracy to obstruct community improvement, and of manipulating city resources for personal vendettas. It ended with a line that chilled Laura more than any of the earlier provocations. You may win on paper, but paper burns. Just like fences rot. Just like public goodwill. Laura stared at the note, not because she feared the words themselves, but because she understood what they meant. Karen was signaling that this was no longer about right or wrong, ownership or boundaries. It was about power, control. And Karen, boxed in by court orders and municipal scrutiny, was now pivoting towards something more personal, more psychological. And so it came as no surprise when, just 3 days later, Laura returned home from a meeting with Ethan to find her garage door halfway open and one of her motion lights smashed on the ground. Nothing inside the garage had been stolen or damaged, but the implication was clear. Someone had been inside or had at least staged it to look that way. Laura filed a police report, and although the responding officer documented the damage, there was no evidence to pursue. No prints, no cameras nearby, and no neighbors who claimed to have seen anything, despite the time of day being just past 5 p.m. But this time, Laura took it further. She hired a private security technician, someone Ethan had worked with on a previous property case, to evaluate her home's perimeter and install a discrete system of sensors and cameras, not visible from the street and not reliant on obvious mounts. The technician installed ground-level motion lines, pressure sensors near the back fence, and a new camera system disguised within standard outdoor lighting fixtures. Laura didn't post warning signs. She didn't want Karen or whoever else was involved to know they were being watched until the moment it became relevant. Within 2 weeks, the system captured its first breach. At 3:18 a.m. on a Thursday, a figure approached the side yard, walked 3 steps onto Laura's property, then backed off. The face was obscured by a hoodie, and the angle of the footage didn't give a clear view, but the posture was unmistakably familiar. Short, lean, and with a stiff-shouldered gait that Laura recognized from dozens of neighborhood sightings. Ethan submitted the footage as part of a supplemental report, not to prove identity, but to demonstrate the pattern of harassment. The judge, reviewing the new information, issued a reinforcement of the restraining order and expanded its terms to include specific prohibitions on entering within 10 feet of Laura's property line. But the escalation didn't stop there. Karen shifted tactics again. At the next city council meeting, during the open comment period, she stood and read from a prepared statement, accusing Laura of undermining a neighborhood initiative meant to improve pedestrian safety and community engagement. She spoke of children who no longer felt welcome to ride their bikes past Laura's yard, of residents who were afraid to speak up due to intimidation and legal threats. She didn't mention Laura by name, but she didn't have to. The video of the meeting was posted to the city's website, and within days, Laura began receiving emails through the contact form of her small business website. Messages from anonymous accounts criticizing her, accusing her of selfishness, of using her legal knowledge to bully others, of standing in the way of progress. One message simply read, "Everyone here knows who you are now. Hope you sleep well." Laura forwarded everything to Ethan, who compiled it into a digital record. He remained calm, analytical, but his tone had changed. He no longer called this a case. He now called it a campaign. The psychological warfare was draining. Laura kept her routines, kept her garden alive, maintained her property with the same care she always had, but the sense of safety that once defined her home had been eroded. She woke up in the middle of the night more often now, sometimes from noises, sometimes from silence that felt too complete. But she never questioned whether to continue. Because with every new tactic Karen employed, with every dirty maneuver meant to bend the neighborhood against her, the more clear it became that this wasn't about offense. It never had been. This was about whether one person, quiet, lawful, principled, could resist the corrosive force of entitlement masquerading as tradition. And the answer, Laura had already decided, would be yes. Not just for her, but as a statement that power doesn't always win when met with persistence, documentation, and the unwillingness to back down. The hearing was now 3 weeks away, and Laura knew it would be the next battlefield. But whatever happened, it would be fought with truth, precision, and the strength of a woman who had already withstood more than her neighbor could ever imagine. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a sky that threatened rain, but held itself in check, gray and heavy and unmoving, as though the air itself was bracing for confrontation. Laura stood outside the courthouse 30 minutes before the scheduled time, not out of nervousness, but preparation. She wore a dark, structured jacket that fit like armor, her documents neatly organized in the same blue folder she had used from the beginning. A quiet ritual that had become a symbol of control in the middle of chaos. Ethan stood beside her, calm and composed, his briefcase locked with precision. Neither of them said much as they waited to be called in. The silence between them was filled with confidence, not hesitation. Laura had done the work. She had gathered the evidence, followed every legal path, resisted every provocation, and never once let herself be baited into behavior that could be twisted against her. If justice meant anything, it would mean something today. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut but controlled. Karen arrived late, as she had during the preliminary hearing, this time wearing a soft gray shawl and glasses she hadn't worn before, an obvious attempt to soften her appearance. Her attorney, a sharp-voiced man who had only recently joined the case, carried a single folder and looked more concerned about his tie than his strategy. The judge, the same one who had granted the initial restraining order, opened the hearing with measured authority, reviewing the purpose of the session. To determine property boundary violations, assess damages, and rule on any associated misconduct. Ethan stood first, and with the same patient clarity he had used throughout, walked the court through the progression of events. He presented the original site survey, copies of Laura's deed, timestamps of the destruction of the fence, photographs showing the timeline of encroachment, and video evidence from the surveillance system capturing the unauthorized entry onto her property. He detailed the fake authorization form, traced the alleged signature, and demonstrated through a side-by-side comparison that the signature was not only falsified but sloppily done, bearing none of the consistent traits of Laura's documented writing. He introduced testimony from the city zoning office, showing how a variance request had been quietly submitted to alter public access in a way that directly benefited Karen and her extended family trust. And finally, he played the short clip from the city council meeting, pointing out the indirect but deliberate smear campaign against Laura, using community rhetoric to pressure her into retreat. When Karen's attorney responded, his argument was scattered and defensive. He leaned heavily on hearsay, suggesting that the previous owner had discussed changing the property line, that Karen had believed the fence was in disrepair and posed a danger to passers-by, and that any construction work had been done in good faith, intended for the betterment of the community. But the judge wasn't interested in hypotheticals. He interrupted twice, requesting sources and clarifications, and each time, Karen's side stumbled. When the judge asked directly whether Karen had ever received explicit permission from Laura to initiate changes on the property, the answer was no. When asked whether Karen had hired the contractors who began the concrete foundation installation, the attorney admitted she had. When asked whether Karen had authored or distributed the anonymous flyers referencing Laura's obstruction, the room went silent. For a moment, it looked as if Karen might deny it outright, but instead, she said nothing at all. Ethan stood again, presenting the final piece of documentation: a formal appraisal of the damage to Laura's lawn, the estimated cost to rebuild the fence using the same material and specifications, and the cost of private security installation, necessitated by the repeated violations of the restraining order. The judge reviewed the paperwork in silence, flipping through the pages with care, then folded his hands and delivered the decision in a firm, measured voice. The court found in favor of Laura Mason. The destruction of private property had been unlawful. The encroachment had been deliberate. The variance application, submitted in coordination with parties related to Karen's family trust, constituted a conflict of interest and was ordered nullified. The judge ordered Karen to pay full damages for the fence, the landscaping, and the legal fees incurred by Laura during the course of the dispute. Moreover, the court issued a formal injunction prohibiting Karen or any associated entities from initiating any modifications, construction, or petitions affecting Laura's property for a period of no less than 5 years. Karen remained seated as the ruling was read, her expression blank, as though she had underestimated just how far this would go, how deeply her actions would unravel once held against the cold weight of evidence. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't respond. Laura didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on the judge, steady and composed, the pounding of her own pulse now finally slowing. As they left the courtroom, Ethan let out a long breath and allowed himself a rare smile. That, he said simply, was comprehensive. Outside, the clouds finally opened. Not with violence, but with a soft, steady drizzle, as if the world itself was cooling off from the weight of the decision. Laura drove home in silence, her hands firm on the wheel, the folder now closed on the passenger seat. The neighborhood was quiet as she pulled into her driveway, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the quiet felt real. Not ominous, not loaded with hidden tension or unspoken threats, but calm. The spot where her fence had once stood was still bare, the soil still uneven, but now it wasn't a battlefield. It was groundwork, a place to rebuild. And this time, she would do so not just with lumber and nails, but with the full force of truth behind her. The boundary would rise again, not in defiance, but in affirmation. That her space was her own, that the law, slow and imperfect as it might be, had teeth when wielded with patience and resolve. And that some people, no matter how entitled, no matter how manipulative, could not simply bulldoze their way through someone else's life without consequence. In the days following the ruling, the atmosphere on Ashwood Drive shifted in ways that were not immediately visible, but could be felt in the subtle changes that only someone who had endured prolonged tension would notice. There were no apologies, no dramatic confrontations, no handwritten letters of regret, just a sudden and sustained quiet from the direction of Karen's house. Her once meticulously groomed yard began to show signs of neglect. The hedges were no longer clipped into geometric perfection. The mulch beds sprouted a few stray weeds, and the overly bright garden lights that had once glared across the street into Laura's living room were turned off permanently. Karen herself did not appear on her front porch anymore, and her car was seen less frequently, as if she had deliberately withdrawn from the neighborhood she once tried to control like a chessboard. There were whispers, of course. A few neighbors began talking again, cautiously, almost sheepishly. One man across the street nodded at Laura for the first time in weeks, and another, who had once gone out of his way to avoid eye contact, offered a quiet, "Glad that's over," as he passed by on a morning walk. It wasn't reconciliation, and it certainly wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement, and in some quiet, adult way that was more honest and satisfying. Laura didn't celebrate with noise or triumph. She didn't host a gathering or send out an update. Instead, she returned to the routines that had once defined her peace. She scheduled the reconstruction of the fence with a local artisan contractor, not the cheapest, but someone with experience in restoring historic property lines. The new fence was built with the same respect for the original aesthetic, but was reinforced with modern materials, anchored deeper, stronger, made to last decades. It wasn't just about marking the boundary, it was about reclaiming the space, making it hers again on her terms. Along the interior side, she planted a new row of native shrubs, slow-growing but resilient, the kind that would settle into the earth and hold their ground with quiet determination. She had the trench damage filled and reseeded the grass, and though it would take time for the lawn to look untouched again, the process of healing had already begun. The security system stayed. Not out of fear, but principle. The cameras remained integrated into the lighting, the motion sensors recalibrated, and the data backups moved to encrypted cloud storage. It wasn't paranoia. It was clarity. Laura had learned through the months of conflict that being prepared was not the same as being afraid. That vigilance was not a weakness, but a form of self-respect. The law had protected her, yes, but only because she had respected the law enough to document everything, to follow every protocol, to remain calm in the face of unrelenting pressure. And in doing so, she had proven something not only to the court, but to herself. That boundaries mattered, and that silence in defense of those boundaries was not submission, but strategy. As spring approached, the street began to thaw, not just from the winter frost, but from the rigid social coldness that had gripped it for months. Laura began to see other small changes. A young couple on the next block, who had just moved in during the height of the conflict, waved to her from their front porch. A retiree who had once silently observed the drama from behind half-closed blinds now offered to help her move a pallet of soil bags from the curb. Even the city inspector, who had handled the earliest stages of her zoning inquiry, stopped by on his lunch break to say the property looked better than ever, and that he had used parts of her case as a training example in an internal workshop on residential encroachment disputes. These weren't grand gestures, but they weren't empty either. They were small signals that people had noticed, and that perhaps, in quiet ways, they had learned something from watching it unfold. Karen, for her part, never spoke to Laura again. The court's injunction stood firm, and any violation would carry immediate penalties. Her presence in neighborhood affairs evaporated. The flyers stopped appearing, the newsletters dried up, and her name ceased to be mentioned at community meetings. Whether she moved away eventually or simply faded into irrelevance, Laura didn't track it. She no longer needed to. The victory wasn't in Karen's silence, it was in Laura's own restored autonomy. Her home was hers again, not just in legal terms, but in emotional and psychological presence. The space was whole, the air lighter, the mornings no longer tainted by the tension of wondering what new sabotage awaited. And so, as she sat one Sunday morning on her rebuilt front steps, a mug of tea in hand, looking out at the new fence and the garden beginning to bloom again, she let herself breathe in the quiet fully, not with the guarded posture of someone expecting the next hit, but with the relief of someone who had come through something, and come through it with her dignity, her rights, and her home intact. The boundary was back, and this time it would hold.